The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning, and I knew before I even answered it that something was wrong, because nobody calls at that hour with good news. I'd learned that lesson years earlier, when a similar late-night call had informed me of my father's heart attack, and some part of my body apparently never forgot the association, because the moment I heard the first ring cut through the darkness of our bedroom, my stomach dropped before my conscious mind had even caught up to what was happening. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, knocking over a glass of water in my haste, and saw Rosa's name lighting up the screen. Rosa had been our housekeeper for almost 11 years by that point, the kind of steady, unflappable woman who'd handled kitchen fires and broken pipes without ever raising her voice, who'd once calmly herded my terrified nephew and his birthday party guests out of the house during a small electrical fire, while simultaneously calling the fire department and locating the extinguisher, all without so much as breaking a sweat. She wasn't someone who panicked. In 11 years of working for our family, first at our primary residence, and more recently helping manage the lake house since I'd inherited it, I had genuinely never once heard her voice carry the particular strain it carried that night. "You need to get here right away," she said, breathless, like she'd been running or crying or both. "Something's happening at the house. I don't know how to explain it, just come, please." I sat up in bed so fast my head spun, my husband Marcus already stirring beside me, his hand finding my arm in the darkness even before I'd fully processed what Rosa had said, some instinct in him also recognizing that this was not an ordinary call. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice thick with sleep but sharpening quickly. "Rosa's at the lake house," I said, already throwing back the covers, my mind racing through a dozen possibilities at once. "She says something's happening." She sounded terrified. I pulled on the nearest clothes I could find, not bothering to turn on the overhead light, working entirely by the dim glow of my phone screen and the streetlight filtering through our bedroom curtains, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to button a shirt that suddenly felt impossibly complicated. The lake house had been my grandmother's before she passed it down to me 2 years earlier, written specifically into her will with a note that had always struck me as strange in its specificity, insisting that the property go to me alone rather than being divided among all her grandchildren the way most of her other assets had been. It was a rambling old property 40 minutes outside the city, built sometime in the 1960s according to the original permits, with additions and renovations layered on over decades that I was slowly working to untangle and restore to something more cohesive. I'd been spending most weekends there for the better part of a year, overseeing contractors during renovation work, gradually falling in love with the property in a way that felt like getting to know my grandmother all over again through the physical space she'd inhabited for so many decades of her life. Rosa had been staying at the lake house periodically to help manage the renovation crew, letting workers in during the week when I couldn't be there myself, keeping an eye on deliveries and making sure nothing important slipped through the cracks while I was tied up with my regular job in the city. But nobody was supposed to be there tonight. I remembered clearly, with a growing sense of confusion layered on top of my alarm, that I'd told Rosa just that afternoon, during our usual end-of-day phone call, that she could take the entire week off once the flooring crew finished up their work, that there was no reason for her to stay overnight at the property at all, certainly no reason for her to be there in the middle of the night. "Why is she even there right now?" Marcus asked, already grabbing his keys from the dish by our bedroom door, moving with the quick efficiency of someone whose adrenaline had fully kicked in. "I don't know," I said, and that not knowing sat like a stone in my chest the entire 40-minute drive out to the lake house, made worse by every scenario I ran through in my head during the tense, mostly silent car ride. A break-in seemed most likely, given how isolated the property was, tucked back from the main road behind a stretch of trees that made it feel private in daylight and unnervingly remote in the middle of the night. Or maybe a fire, given how much electrical work had been done recently, wiring that had passed inspection but that I still eyed nervously every time I walked past the newly finished sections of the house. Or an accident with the renovation crew's equipment, something left carelessly plugged in or improperly stored that had somehow caused damage or injury once everyone had gone home for the day. I tried calling Rosa back twice during the drive, my hands unsteady on the phone, but both calls went straight to voicemail, her cheerful, ordinary outgoing message feeling jarringly out of place against the anxiety twisting through my chest. Marcus drove faster than he usually would, taking the winding back roads toward the lake with a tense focus that told me he was just as unsettled as I was, even though neither of us said much during the drive itself, both of us apparently preferring to keep our worst imagined scenarios to ourselves rather than voice them out loud and make them feel more real. "Should we call the police?" Marcus asked at one point, about halfway there, breaking the silence. "And tell them what?" "That our housekeeper called sounding scared, and I don't know why." I shook my head, even though he couldn't fully see the gesture in the dark car. "Let's just get there first. If it's actually an emergency, we'll call as soon as we see what's going on." We pulled up to the lake house a little after 3:30, headlights sweeping across the gravel driveway, and the first thing I noticed was that every light in the place was on, blazing out into the dark like the house itself was holding its breath, every window glowing against the black backdrop of the surrounding trees and the lake beyond. It was such an unusual sight, given that the house typically sat dark and quiet at night, that some deeper animal part of my brain registered it as wrong before my conscious mind had even finished processing the image. Rosa's car was parked crookedly in the driveway, nose angled slightly toward the garden bed along the walkway, driver's door still hanging open, dome light glowing faintly inside the empty vehicle. There was no sign of her anywhere near it, no sign of movement in any of the illuminated windows, just the strange, tense quiet of a house lit up like a beacon with apparently no one visible inside or out. I ran up the porch steps calling her name, my voice sounding strange and too loud against the surrounding quiet of the lake at night, my husband right behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, quick and tense, matching my own. The front door was unlocked, standing slightly ajar, which sent another spike of alarm through me because Rosa was meticulous about locking up, had been for 11 years, and an open door felt like one more piece of evidence supporting whatever worst-case scenario my mind kept circling back toward. Inside, the house looked untouched at first glance. Nothing broken, nothing disturbed, furniture exactly where it should be, which somehow made the whole scene feel more unsettling rather than less, the eerie normalcy of everything visible making the wrongness of the situation feel even more disorienting. And then, cutting through the strange stillness of the house, I heard Rosa's voice coming from somewhere upstairs, low and urgent, talking to someone I couldn't identify, and Marcus and I looked at each other for exactly 1 second before both bolting toward the staircase. I found her in my grandmother's old study, a room we hadn't touched yet during the renovation, still full of the original furniture and boxes of papers nobody had gone through since she passed nearly 2 years earlier. The room had always felt slightly frozen in time compared to the rest of the house, the one space I'd deliberately left alone while contractors tore through the kitchen and bathrooms, partly because I hadn't been ready to sort through decades of my grandmother's belongings and partly because something about the room's quiet, undisturbed quality had felt worth preserving a little longer. Rosa was kneeling on the floor in front of an open-wall panel I'd never even known existed. A section of built-in bookshelf swung outward on some kind of hidden hinge mechanism to reveal a narrow, hidden compartment behind it, roughly the depth of a large filing cabinet, and she was pulling out bundles of yellowed documents with shaking hands. The bookshelf itself had always looked entirely ordinary to me, floor-to-ceiling oak shelving that ran along the entire back wall of the study, filled with my grandmother's collection of hardcover novels and old encyclopedias that I'd walked past 100 times over the last 2 years without ever suspecting it concealed anything. "Rosa, what is going on?" I asked, my heart still pounding from the drive, from the run up the stairs, from the entire surreal quality of the scene in front of me, my voice coming out higher and more strained than I intended. She looked up at me, eyes wide, chest still rising and falling quickly, and I could see now that her panic wasn't about danger exactly, not the kind of danger I'd been imagining the whole drive over. No intruder, no fire, no injured contractor. "I came back for my umbrella," she said, words tumbling out fast, almost apologetic in their urgency. "I forgot it under the kitchen table this afternoon, and I remembered it right before bed and figured I'd just swing by since it wasn't far from my place, and I knew I'd need it tomorrow with the forecast." I let myself in with my key like always, and when I came inside, I heard this strange sound coming from up here, like something shifting or settling, almost like furniture moving. I thought maybe the contractors had left something running, or maybe an animal had gotten into the house through a window they'd left open. She paused, glancing back at the compartment, still visibly shaken. I came up to check, and I found this panel had come loose from the wall, like it had swung open partway on its own, and when I got closer, I could see all this paper inside. I don't know what triggered it, whether something in the mechanism finally gave way after all these years, or whether it was already slightly ajar and just needed a nudge, but the second I saw your grandmother's handwriting on some of the envelopes sticking out, I didn't know what to do. It felt wrong to just leave it, and it felt wrong to touch it without you here, but it also felt wrong to just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. So I called you. I knelt down beside her, my knees pressing into the old hardwood floor, and Marcus crouched on my other side, both of us looking at what Rosa had already pulled partway out of the compartment. Old letters, dozens of them from what I could see, their envelopes brittle and yellowed at the edges, some of them slightly foxed with age spots, addressed in handwriting I recognized instantly as my grandmother's careful, looping script, the same handwriting that had filled decades of birthday cards and recipe notes throughout my childhood. Beneath the letters, a stack of official-looking documents bound together with a disintegrating ribbon that had once probably been a deep burgundy but had faded to a dull brownish pink. And beneath those, tucked at the very back of the compartment, as though deliberately placed to be found last, something that made my breath catch entirely, a leather journal, worn soft and slightly cracked at the edges from age and handling, with my grandmother's initials embossed in small, elegant letters on the cover. She never mentioned any of this, I said quietly, almost to myself, reaching out to touch the edge of the journal, but not quite picking it up yet, some part of me needing a moment before I actually opened it. I've been through this house a dozen times over the last 2 years, going through drawers, cataloging furniture for the renovation, going through her filing cabinet downstairs. I never even knew this panel existed. I didn't know this bookshelf did anything but hold books. Rosa shook her head, still visibly shaken, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warm night air drifting through the open window. I wasn't trying to snoop, I promise you that. I want you to know that first, before anything else. I heard the noise, and then I saw the papers and your grandmother's name on some of the envelopes, and I just felt like I couldn't wait until morning to tell you. It felt important the second I saw it. It felt like something you needed to see right away, not something that should just sit here another night with nobody watching over it, especially with contractors coming and going during the day. What if one of them had found it first, moving furniture around for the next phase of work? What if it had gotten thrown out by accident, or damaged, or just quietly gone missing? I understood her reasoning even through the fog of adrenaline still coursing through me, understood the particular kind of protective instinct that had apparently driven her to call me at nearly 3 in the morning rather than wait for a more reasonable hour. Rosa had known my grandmother personally during the last several years of her life, had cared for her during a difficult stretch when her health first started declining, and I realized now, watching her carefully guard this discovery until I could arrive, that some part of her felt a genuine responsibility toward protecting whatever remained of my grandmother's legacy, even in the middle of the night, even at the cost of her own sleep and peace of mind. I picked up the journal carefully, its spine cracking slightly with age as I opened the cover, and found the first page dated nearly 50 years earlier, my grandmother's handwriting filling the page in dense, careful lines that looked different from the handwriting I remembered from her later years, younger somehow, more urgent in its pressure against the page. My husband put a hand on my shoulder, quiet, letting me have the moment without pushing me to explain what I was feeling or rushing me to read further, because honestly I wasn't sure I could have explained it even if he'd asked, some tangle of grief and curiosity and a strange, disorienting sense of meeting a stranger who happened to share my grandmother's face. "Thank you for calling," I told Rosa, my voice thick, reaching over to squeeze her hand where it rested on the floor beside the compartment. "You did exactly the right thing. I mean that. If you'd waited, if you'd second-guessed yourself and gone home instead, I don't know how long this would have sat here undiscovered, or what might have happened to it during the rest of the renovation." Rosa nodded, some of the tension finally easing out of her shoulders now that she'd handed the discovery fully into my hands, now that the responsibility of it no longer rested solely with her. I just kept thinking, what if it's something important, something she wanted someone to find eventually? It felt wrong to sit on it, even for a few hours. Downstairs, I could hear Marcus moving toward the kitchen, already filling the coffee maker, some practical instinct in him recognizing that whatever this discovery turned out to be, we were going to be up for the rest of the night working through it, and none of us were going anywhere until we understood exactly what my grandmother had hidden away, undisturbed, for who knew how many decades inside the walls of her own study. We spent the rest of that night, all three of us, sitting on the floor of my grandmother's old study going through what the hidden compartment had held, coffee brewing downstairs by the time the sky outside started turning gray at the edges. Marcus made trip after trip up the stairs with fresh mugs, setting them down beside us, without a word each time, apparently understanding that neither Rosa nor I wanted to break the strange, careful rhythm we'd fallen into as we worked through the discovery piece by piece. The journal turned out to span nearly 2 decades of my grandmother's life, starting in her early 30s, long before I was born, filled with entries that revealed a woman I'd only ever known as quiet and reserved, someone who spent her later years content with crossword puzzles and gardening and Sunday phone calls that rarely lasted more than 15 minutes. The woman in these pages was different, more vivid somehow, writing with an urgency and emotional openness that felt almost startling to encounter after a lifetime of knowing her as someone carefully composed, someone who'd once told me, when I was going through a difficult breakup in my 20s, that dwelling on feelings too long was how you let them run your whole life instead of the other way around. Reading her private thoughts from decades earlier, I began to understand that advice differently, less like inherited wisdom and more like something she'd learned the hard way, through experience she'd never fully explained to any of us. The letters, it turned out, were correspondence between her and a man named Thomas, someone none of us had ever heard mentioned in nearly 30 years of family gatherings, not once, not even in passing during the long, rambling stories my grandmother liked to tell about her younger years. The correspondence spanned almost 15 years, according to the dates on the envelopes, documenting what was unmistakably a deep, complicated love affair that had apparently run alongside her marriage to my grandfather for a significant portion of it, though the letters themselves, at least the ones I read that night, suggested something more emotionally entangled than simply an affair in the way that word usually implies. Thomas wrote about music, about books they'd apparently discussed at length, about a shared longing that came through clearly even in handwriting I was reading for the first time, decades after it had been written. The final letter in the bundle, dated the year I turned 3 years old according to a small note my grandmother had added in the margin much later in different ink, made clear that whatever this relationship had been, it ended not because the feeling had faded, but because of circumstances neither of them could apparently overcome. Circumstances the letter referenced only obliquely, something about obligations and a family that needed her more than her own happiness did. There was no scandal in it exactly, nothing salacious or shocking in the way you might expect from discovering old love letters at 3 in the morning, nothing that changed how I felt about my grandmother as a person. If anything, it deepened how I felt about her, gave me a fuller, more complicated picture of a woman I'd loved my whole life, but had somehow never fully known, someone who had apparently carried an entire private history of longing and sacrifice quietly inside herself for decades without a single member of our family ever suspecting it existed. The documents beneath the letters turned out to be something else entirely, deeds and paperwork for a small property 2 states away, purchased, according to the earliest document in the stack, quietly in her 40s, years after the correspondence with Thomas had ended, using funds from what appeared to be a modest inheritance from her own mother that she'd apparently never mentioned to my grandfather or anyone else in the family. The property, a small cottage according to the description on the deed, sat on a few acres near a lake not entirely unlike the one our current house overlooked, and I found myself wondering, as I read through the paperwork, whether she'd chosen that particular kind of setting deliberately, some echo of a life she'd imagined for herself once, in another version of events. According to the most recent tax documents tucked into the bundle, dated just a few years before her death, the property technically still belonged to the estate, quietly maintained through a small trust she'd apparently set up decades earlier, property taxes paid automatically each year through an account none of the rest of the family had ever known to look for. Which meant, by extension, that it now belonged to me, along with the rest of the estate she'd left specifically in my name, a detail I now understood in an entirely new light, wondering suddenly whether her insistence on leaving the lake house solely to me, rather than dividing it among all her grandchildren, had been connected somehow to this hidden second property. This secret life she'd apparently wanted someone in the family to eventually uncover. Rosa stayed with us the entire night, making coffee, occasionally translating a phrase here or there in the older letters that had drifted into Spanish partway through certain paragraphs, phrases my grandmother had apparently picked up from Rosa's own grandmother, who I learned that night had worked for my grandmother decades earlier during the very years these letters were being written. A friendship between the two women that spanned generations before eventually leading Rosa herself into our family's employ, a connection none of us had ever fully discussed before that night. Rosa explained, quietly, over her third cup of coffee, that her grandmother had mentioned once, years earlier, that my grandmother had a whole life nobody in that big house of hers ever saw, a comment Rosa had never fully understood until that moment, kneeling on the study floor at nearly 4 a.m, finally seeing proof of exactly what her grandmother had meant. By the time the sun was fully up, streaming gold light through the study's east-facing window, and catching the dust motes we'd stirred up going through decades of paper, we'd only made it through about a third of what the compartment had held, the letters and journal taking priority over the remaining documents we hadn't yet examined, a stack of what looked like old photographs bundled separately, still waiting to be opened. But I already felt like I understood my grandmother, and by extension myself, in some new and unexpected way, some sense of inherited resilience and quiet sacrifice that I hadn't fully appreciated before that night, threads of her that I could suddenly trace forward into my own life, into decisions I'd made without ever quite understanding where that particular strength had come from. "I'm sorry I panicked," Rosa said quietly, as we finally sat exhausted at the kitchen table sometime past 6, the discovery spread out in careful piles between mugs of coffee none of us had really touched, condensation pooling on the wood beneath them. "I just didn't know what else to do. It felt too important to wait, but now, looking back, maybe I should have just secured the room and called you first thing in the morning instead of waking you both up in the middle of the night like that." "Don't apologize," I told her, meaning it completely, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand again. "If you'd waited until morning, if you'd just left it and gone home, gone to sleep, I might have walked past that room a dozen more times without ever noticing that panel, without ever knowing to look for it. Contractors could have started work on that wall next week without any of us realizing what was hidden behind it. You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing, something I might have lost entirely without ever knowing it existed." I looked at the journal, still open in front of me on the kitchen table, my grandmother's handwriting filling page after page of a life fuller and more mysterious than I'd ever imagined possible for the quiet, careful woman I'd known my entire childhood and well into adulthood. "You gave me her, really, a whole hidden part of her, in a way I never had before and never would have found on my own." Marcus, who'd been mostly quiet through the last hour, listening more than talking as Rosa and I worked through the discovery together, finally spoke up, resting his hand over mine on the table. "What are you going to do with the cottage? The one 2 states away?" I hadn't fully considered that question yet, too absorbed in the emotional weight of everything else we'd uncovered to think practically about what came next. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Part of me wants to go see it, actually stand where she must have stood, understand what she was building for herself out there. Part of me wonders if it's better left alone, whatever she wanted it to be just for her." I looked back down at the journal, at the careful, urgent handwriting of a woman 30 years younger than the grandmother I remembered. "I think I need to finish reading first, understand the whole story before I decide what to do with any of it." We sat there a while longer as the morning light filled the kitchen fully, birds starting up outside the window overlooking the lake, and I realized that whatever renovation plans I'd had for that lake house, whatever schedule the contractors were working toward when they arrived later that morning expecting business as usual, all of it had just become secondary to something far more important: the slow, careful work of getting to know a woman I'd thought I already knew completely, one yellowed letter at a time, one journal entry at a time, guided unexpectedly into this discovery by a phone call in the middle of the night from a woman who'd trusted her instincts enough to say something felt too important to leave until morning. I never did find out exactly what caused that panel to swing open on its own after so many decades sealed shut, whether it was simple mechanical failure after 50 years or something closer to timing that felt, in the quiet exhaustion of that morning, almost impossible to write off as pure coincidence.